This is an OCR A-level biology video on mammalian nervous systems. This is going to be quite a lengthy video, I don't know how long, but there's a lot to cover in this video. Just flicking through it now, have a look at some of this. This muscle stuff will be in a separate third video, and that will be the end of unit 5.5. This is what we did last video, but you don't care about that. Let's just get going with mammalian nervous system. So it has a role in responding to the environment. So as we know, good communication systems must enable detection of changes in the environment, cell signalling between all parts of the body, coordination of a range of effectors to carry out responses to sensory input, and it must have suitable responses to each stimulus. So the nervous system deals with rapid responses such as balance, temperature regulation and muscle action. And we're going to look at all those in a bit more depth, but let's just look at our divisions within our nervous system. And it's really quite extensive. So we've got the nervous system, it's got two main branches, the central nervous system, CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, PNS. The central nervous system has got the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system has got sensory system and the motor system. And the motor system is once again split down into somatic and autonomic nervous systems, and our autonomic nervous system, which isn't shown in the diagram, is split down either further into sympathetic and parasympathetic. But first of all, let's look at the brain. So the brain is the main part of the CNS really. It is formed of non-myelinated grey matter. It's got relay neurons within it. It's mostly just relay neurons, and this grey matter is caused by the non-myelination, which appears grey. Spinal cord also has this non-myelinated relay neuron grey matter, but it's also got this outer region of myelinated white matter, and within this white matter we've got myelinated neurons. They carry action potentials up and down the spinal cord for rapid communication over longer distances, and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. Between each vertebrae, peripheral nerves, which are here, enter and leave the spinal cord to transfer impulses to the rest of the body. So let's have a look at the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system is pretty much to do with all the effectors within the body. So it ensures rapid communication between sensory receptors, CNS and the effectors. So it basically connects the CNS to the effectors and receptors. It's composed of sensory and motor neurons bundled together in connective tissue sheath to form nerves. So we've got these two forms. Sorry about my phone, silence that. We've got sensory neurons and motor neuron system. So sensory system basically is just sensory neurons, and they send their action potentials to the CNS. So dendrons of sensory neurons enter the CNS, conducting action potentials from sensory receptors to the CNS. These neurons have their cell body in the dorsal root, leading to the spinal cord, and a short axon connecting other neurons in the CNS. So then we've got this motor system, which conducts action potentials from the CNS to effectors. So it's basically sensory receptors and how they're sort of bound within our spinal, how they're connected to the CNS, and then we've got motor neurons and how they're connected to the CNS. And these motor neurons conduct action potentials from the CNS to the effectors. We've got these two types, somatic and autonomic. Somatic motor neurons are under voluntary control, such as skeletal muscles. They're mostly myelinated, so they get rapid responses, and always one single motor neuron connecting the CNS to the effector. So under voluntary control there's only one motor neuron to be controlled. Autonomic nervous system, they are involuntary, myelinated once again, but they consist of two neurons connected to the ganglia, which we call small swellings. Autonomic means self-governing. It's responsible for homeostatic mechanisms. It can be sympathetic or parasympathetic. Antagonistic systems are when one system opposes the other, and we'll look at muscles in another video, a different sort of meaning of antagonist. At rest, action potentials pass along both systems at a low frequency, controlled by the subconscious part of the brain. So autonomic is subconscious, somatic is conscious, and the main two differences are the one neuron in the somatic, two neurons in the autonomic. So then I produced this little table comparing sympathetic to parasympathetic, because what I hate about tables is when you write one column and then the other column you just have to write it all out again, but just the opposite. So what I've done here is just put these list of structures or sort of functions and literally just on a table where we can compare sympathetic to parasympathetic. So first of all, number of nerves. Sympathetic system has many nerves, parasympathetic has few. Then we've got ganglia positioning. Remember, these are small swellings. In the sympathetic, they're just outside the CNS, but in the parasympathetic, they're within the effector tissue. So sympathetic therefore have these short preganglionic neurons, whereas parasympathetic have long preganglionic neurons. Sympathetic have long postganglionic neurons, whereas parasympathetic have short postganglionic neurons. And this is a big importance here. Sympathetic use neuroadrenaline as their neurotransmitter, whereas parasympathetic use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. And the role of sympathetic is to increase activity, whereas parasympathetic decreases activity. So they're pretty much opposite in every aspect. But let's have a look here what sort of things we're controlling with these two things. So sympathetic increases heart rate, it dilates pupils, increases ventilation rate, decreases your digestion rate, and it's also, I didn't write it down, but it's also for orgasms, in case you're interested. Parasympathetic lowers your heart rate, it constricts your pupils, it lowers your ventilation rate, but it increases digestion. So once again, they're completely opposite. And parasympathetic is actually for sexual arousal, which I find quite confusing. You get slowly sexually aroused by your parasympathetic nerves, but then you orgasm. A nice intense sympathetic signal controls your orgasm. Okay. I don't know, someone asked me in a previous video to make a few predictions what will come up. I don't know if orgasms will come up, but I actually doubt it. Anyway, let's move on to the brain. So I spared you the pain of me drawing out the brain myself. There is a region that I have to draw on later because it's not put in this diagram, it's hidden. But let's look at each part highlighted here. So first of all, we've got the cerebrum, and that is for the region of the brain dealing with higher functions such as conscious thought and memory, divided into two cerebral hemispheres. These two cerebral hemispheres are connected via major tracts of neurons called the corpus callosum. The outermost layer of the cerebrum consists of a thin layer of nerve bodies called the cerebral cortex, and the cerebrum controls conscious thought, conscious actions, emotional responses. It's responsible for intelligence, reasoning, judgment, decision making, and factual memory. And I can think of a few people that I know that probably do have a damaged cerebrum. You can make what you want out of that. Cerebral cortex subdivisions. So we've got sensory areas, association areas, and motor areas. So sensory areas are receive action potentials indirectly from sensory receptors. The size of the regions are relative to the sensitivity of the area that they receive input from. So basically, sensory areas pick up the stimulus from sensory neurons. Then we've got association areas, which compare these sensory inputs with previous experiences. So that's sort of like memory. It's interpreting these signals and can help judge an appropriate response, which is quite amazing when you think about it. And then you've finally got this motor area, which speaks for itself. Motor neurons, they send action potentials to various effectors. The size of the regions, once again, are relative to the complexity of the movements needed. Motor areas on the left side of the brain actually control the effectors on the right side of the body, and I think it will be the opposite. Don't think that's a really necessary fact for you to know anyway. Who knows? Who knows what OCR are going to hit us with this year? Next, we've got the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is the region of the brain which coordinates movement and balance. It receives information from sensory receptors and processes the information accurately. Your conscious decision to contract voluntary muscles is initiated by the cerebral cortex, but it does not provide complex signals to coordinate complex movements. So it's really just dealing with simple movements. Some example of this are maintaining your body position and balance, such as when you're riding your bike, judging position of objects and limbs during movement, so like hand-eye coordination sort of, slight tensioning of muscles to use instruments and tools, like if you're holding a hammer and just doing basic movements, that's done by your cerebellum. And then we've got coordinating contraction and relaxation of antagonistic skeletal muscles when walking and running. So really basic tasks, something that doesn't involve too many movements, just basic movements. Usually is associated with slow movements, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. To get this movement and balance control, it often takes a lot of learning. It requires complex nervous pathways which are strengthened through practice. Complex activity becomes programmed by the cerebellum. The cerebrum and cerebellum are connected by this region here, the pons. So let's remember, this is our cerebrum. It's huge. It's the main part of the brain. Then you've got this green bit of cerebellum, not actually green in real life. Pons here, and it connects both the cerebrum and cerebellum. Then we've got the medulla, and the medulla is the region of the brain that coordinates physiological processes. It controls non-skeletal muscles, cardiac and involuntary smooth muscles, and sends action potentials via autonomic nervous system. It's got three centres: the cardiac centre, the vasomotor centre, and the respiratory centre. The cardiac centre regulates heart rate, vasomotor centre regulates circulation and blood pressure, and the respiratory centre controls rate and depth of breathing. So it coordinates vital functions by negative feedback. It's a word you must have missed for a long time. It's always coming up in Unit 5, negative feedback. This does overlap, the action of the medulla does overlap a bit with previous topics. But that's all I'm going to have to say on it now. Finally, we've got this region that I've had to draw on myself because it was missing, and that's because it's sort of hidden behind this cerebrum. So if we cut one of these cerebrums out, we'd see in the middle our hypothalamus and pituitary complex. And our hypothalamus and pituitary complex is responsible for controlling homeostatic mechanisms within the body, containing its own sensory receptors which act through negative feedback once again. Love a bit of negative feedback, don't we? And there's two main things: temperature and osmoregulation. So the hypothalamus detects a change in the body temperature and receives sensory input from temperature receptors on the skin, initiates responses to regulate body temperature within a narrow range which can be mediated by the nervous system or hormonal system. And the hormonal system is mediated by the pituitary gland. Osmoregulation, we've looked at this before, so I'll really quickly go through it. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus monitor water potential in the blood. When the water potential changes, osmoreceptors initiate a response which causes a reversal of this change, mediated by the pituitary gland. Again, so the pituitary gland is really important here. Remember, in our pituitary gland we've got these two areas. Well, I'm saying remember, you've probably never looked at this before. So the anterior lobe produces its own hormones, which are released into the blood in response to releasing factors produced by the hypothalamus, which they only have to travel a short distance to, obviously, because they're sort of connected in this complex. And therefore a response to stress, growth, reproduction, lactation, okay, which is producing milk. The posterior lobe is linked to the hypothalamus by specialised neurosecretory cells, which hormones such as ADH pass down and are released into the blood. If you've seen my video on 5.2, we speak about how ADH is released through these neurosecretory cells, and then how that affects the collecting duct permeability by releasing aquaporins. Okay, I'm not going to go into that now. That is pretty much all you need to know on the structure of the brain. In the book there are the lobes, so like you've got the visionary centre. Personally, I'm not learning them. You might want to check your specification if you should learn them, but I just think it's a picture the textbook put in the book. I'm pretty sure you don't need to know it. Obviously, I'm not the teacher. I'm trying to reiterate this point again. If you want to learn it, learn it. If you think you should learn it, please learn it. It's not something you really need teaching to you. It's just learning the positioning of the lobes in the brain. But yeah, if you want to be with me, don't learn it. Then we've got reflex actions. So reflex actions are responses to changes in environment that do not require any process in the brain to coordinate the movement. We've got this pathway, the sensory neuron to relay neuron to motor neuron. The brain is informed about the reflex, so it knows it's happened, but the brain does not coordinate our response. So we've got lots of different examples of reflex actions here. And one's the blinking reflex, and there's all sorts of ways this can be caused. We've got so our blinking reflex is a cranial reflex, so that means that this signal passes through the brain. Obviously your eyes, in your head, the signal is going to go through the brain, but it does not mean that the brain is controlling it. It's a reflex arc, as the receptor and the effector are in the same place. That's a really nice way to remember it. And some ways we can get this blinking reflex is through bright light, so that'll be your optical reflex, loud sounds, and the corneal reflex, which I feel like I should speak to you a little bit about, because it is something that the book goes into a fair amount of detail on. So the corneal reflex is mediated by a sensory neuron from the cornea, which enters the pons, and remember our pons is the part in the brain connecting our cerebrum and cerebellum. A synapse connects the sensory neuron to a relay neuron, which passes the action potential to a motor neuron. Okay, so this pathway, we've got a synapse connecting these neurons, and that's just what you'd expect. So if you've looked at my nerve video, you know that's how action potentials are passed along, through synapses. The motor neuron passes back out of the brain to the facial muscles, causing the eyelid to blink. This is a really short pathway. It's about 0.1 seconds long. Both eyes blink. It's not just a pathway for one. The motor neuron is connected to both eyes. If you get any of these things, so bright light, loud sounds, you won't just wink with one eye. I think that would look a bit weird. Both eyes blink, even if one eye is only affected. So like, if you get bright light in one eye, both eyes will close. This reflex action can be overridden by conscious control, as inhibitory signals are sent to the motor centre within the pons via myelinated neurons, which are much faster and prevent the formation of motor neuron action potentials, thus overriding this response. Basically, any reflex action involving a relay neuron can be overcome by myelinated neurons basically getting to that synapse before the signal to this, getting to this motor neuron synapse before the relay signal gets to it, because then it can override the signal. And so if you try really hard, don't really advise it, but You can poke yourself in the eye without closing your eyes, because you can consciously try and prevent the reflex action from happening, but it takes a few attempts. But please don't go poking your eyes out. We've got the optical reflex as well, so this protects light sensitive cells in the retina from damage. Stimulus by retina, it's mediated by the optical centre in the cerebral cortex, but it is slower than the corneal reflex. And obviously these reflexes are really important. That the whole point they're a reflex. Sort of think of it more like a domino response. If you get poked in the eye, it activates the stimulus, which is your first domino, and all the dominoes fall over until you get to the last domino, which is your effector, and it closes your eyelid. Okay, so reflex arcs are more like a domino chain. Okay, just thought about that on the spot. Then we've got knee-jerk reflex, and the knee-jerk reflex, I think most people will be aware of. It's a spinal reflex, so the nervous pathway passes through the spine rather than the brain, so it's not a cranial reflex. It is involved in coordinated movement and balance. Muscle spindles detect an increase in the length of the muscle. If a stretching of the muscle is unexpected, it causes a reflex action to make the same muscle contract. And this is the interesting thing. It only involves sensory and motor neuron. There is no relay neuron in between. This means it cannot be overridden. Because, as you should know, as I've already mentioned, myelinated action potentials to relay synapse at the motor relay synapse. If we get a myelinated neuron there, we can inhibit that reflex action and we can override it. So no relay response. So if you've got no relay neuron, you can not be overridden. How does it happen then? So muscle spindles detect unexpected stretch. So these muscle spindles are attached to this ligament. They detect the ligament at the knee being stretched unexpectedly, because then they've not contracted. This should not be happening. They should not be getting longer. Obviously there's going to be some sort of reaction to that, and that reaction is to contract the same muscle, hence your leg kicks up. So doctors like to test that reflex by hitting your knee with a little hammer. I think it's got a special name, but I don't know or care. Then we've got fight or flight responses. And been lazy, I've took a picture of my notes, but why write this all out again, especially when I've got less than a week now till my exam. So, physiological change. The pupils dilate, it allows more light to enter the eyes, and the retina become more sensitive. Heart rate and blood pressure increase. The increase in the rate of blood flow to deliver more oxygen and glucose to the muscles, remove CO2 and other toxins. We also see vasoconstriction of digestive system, arterioles, and vasodilation at the muscles and liver. It diverts blood flow away from metabolism to the muscles ready for fight or flight. Increase in blood glucose supplies energy for muscular contraction, so that's why we also send blood flow to the liver, so we can release glucose from glycogen stores within the liver. Metabolic rate increases, not within your digestive system, but within other cells. It converts glucose to usable forms of energy such as ATP. Erector pili muscles in the skin can contract, so your hairs stand up on end, and that's a sign of aggression. Your ventilation rate and depth increases. This therefore increases gaseous exchange, more oxygen is respired, more toxins are removed, so CO2 is removed, and endorphins released in the brain. So wounds inflicted within the fight or flight response do not prevent activity. So basically, endorphins numb your sensitivity to pain, so which is a really handy thing in the physiological fight or flight response, because if you get punched or something and you have to cower over in pain, you will not be able to fight. You will end up dying, but it depends how serious your fight is. But endorphins obviously numb that pain. So you find if you've been in a situation like that, you end up turning to this sort of superhuman, fighting off this bad guy, and then you'll find during it you've got a few punches, a few cuts, a few bruises, but afterwards you get back to your safe place, and it hurts. I have not actually been in that situation. I know it sounds like I have been. I've not been in a fight. I've been attacked. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I'm absolutely losing my mental capabilities, my thought processes with all this revision, 10-hour days. Inputs feed into the sensory centre within the cerebrum. The cerebrum passes the signal to association centres. If the threat is recognised, the cerebrum stimulates the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus increases activity in the sympathetic nervous system and stimulates the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. And that is your fight or flight response, controlled by your sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous signals from your hypothalamus are sent to your adrenal medulla. This causes the release of adrenaline. Adrenaline then binds to cells, forming that hormone receptor complex. So it must be a target cell with a complementary receptor to the adrenaline. This causes a G protein within the inside of the cell membrane to become activated. It stimulates adenyl cyclase, which converts ATP into cyclic AMP or CAMP. This CAMP activates an enzyme action, and in different cells it has a different response. So, for example, some cells will release endorphins as a response to that. Other cells may be in your pupils, so your pupils may dilate in response to your pupils are not a cell, by the way, don't write that down. They might, whatever cell controls pupils, I cannot remember from GCSE, it will cause them to dilate, and you get that different response in different cells. But most cells are reactive, well, not reactive, they react to adrenaline. Then we've got this release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones into the blood, releasing factors. So we call these releasing factors. They pass down a portal vessel into the pituitary gland to stimulate the release of tropic hormones, which stimulate activity in a variety of endocrine glands. So corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH passes around the blood, stimulating the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroid hormones such as cortisol, which regulates the metabolism of carbohydrates, releasing more glucose from glycogen stores into the blood, as well as producing more glucose from fat and proteins. So basically we're increasing metabolism. Then we've also got thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. It causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. And TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to release more thyroxine, which increases the metabolic rate of all cells, making them more sensitive to adrenaline. And Jesus, that was complicated. Lots of huge words, and it's going to take a lot of going over that to learn it. Not complicated though, it is literally just these arrows. You've just got to learn them in order. For these ones at the bottom for your pituitary gland responses, they're probably not as detailed as you'd like to learn them, so have a look in your textbook. But it is simple. It's just the process and the new words you've got to learn in order. Finally, as this video is going on, but I can't help it, it's a huge topic. We've got to look at controlling the heart rate. So I'm not going to spend long controlling the heart rate, as we've seen it in Unit 3. But obviously we need the heart to transport nutrients, oxygen, remove waste products, transport urea from the liver and kidneys, distribute heat around the body. But that's why it's needed. But we need to adapt its function, because we need to raise or lower the heart rate, we need to alter the contraction ventricular walls and alter the stroke volume for various reasons. Pacemakers can artificially control the heart rate, being connected to the SAN sinoatrial node, but the natural way of doing this is through your sympathetic and parasympathetic, so autonomic nervous system. So sympathetic nerve is the accelerans nerve, the vagus nerve is your parasympathetic nerve, and depending on input from stretch receptors, chemoreceptors, and carotid sinus stretch receptors, which detect basically blood pressure within your heart. So basically, the medulla oblongata decides whether we want to speed up by the accelerans nerve or slow down via the vagus nerve. Usually we're looking at about 60 to 80 waves of excitation per minute by the SAN. We've got this myogenic heart muscle, so you know it controls itself, and that's through SAN, AVN, bundle of His, Purkinje fibres, which I'm not going to speak about because I look at that in depth in a different video. Nerves in the cardiovascular centre and the medulla oblongata supply the SAN. Let's just make it clear, these two nerves, accelerans and vagus, they do not initiate contraction, they alter the frequency of contraction. So the initiator of contraction is always the SAN, however the frequency that the SAN initiates contractions is altered by these nerves. That is all I've got to do on the mammalian nervous system, and boy was it a big topic. The last one in Unit 5 is muscles. I'm going to record that straight away, put another video out. I'll put these two videos out together. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.